Hello, Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger. My name is David Klein-Rodick from Lincolnshire, Illinois. Thank you for letting me ask the first question. I wanted to say I am sorry for the loss of your friend, Mrs. Graham, last year. My question is, you have said that your favorite time to own a stock is forever, yet you sold McDonald's and Disney after not owning them for long. How do you decide when to hold forever and when to sell? And also, are you and Mr. Munger wearing Fruit of the Looms?
Charlie? I think I better answer the question. I can answer unequivocally, I am wearing Fruit of the Loom. And I'm not sure whether Charlie wears underwear, do you?
I haven't bought any new underwear in a long time, and therefore I'm inappropriately attired.
He's waiting for a discount. Don't let him kid you. Well, the answer, it's a very good question about selling. I mean, it's not our natural inclination to sell. And on the other hand, and we have held the Washington Post stock since 1973. I've never sold a share of Berkshire, having bought the first shares in 1962. And we've held Coke stock since 1988. We've held Gillette stock since 1989. Held American Express stock since 1991. We had actually previously been an American Express in the 60s and Disney. So there are companies we're familiar with. We generally sell, well, we would sell if we needed money for something else, but that has not been the problem in the last 10 or 15 years. That 40 years ago, my sales were all because I found something that I liked even better. I hated to sell what I sold, but I also didn't want to borrow money. So I would reluctantly sell something that I thought was terribly cheap to buy something that was even cheaper. Those were the times when I had more ideas than money. Now I've got more money than ideas, and that's a different equation. So now we sell really when we think that when we're reevaluating the economic characteristics of the business. In other words, if you take them, don't want to name names, but take a stock we've sold of some sort. We probably had one view of the long-term competitive advantage of the company at the time we bought it, and we may have modified that. That doesn't mean we think that the company is going into some disastrous period or anything remotely like that. We think McDonald's has a fine future. We think Disney has a fine future, and there are others. But we probably don't think that their competitive advantage is as strong as we might have thought, as we thought it was when we initially made the decision. That may mean that we were wrong when we made the decision originally. It may mean that we're wrong now, and that their strengths are every bit as what they were before. But for one reason or another, we think that the strengths may have been eroded to some degree. A classic case on that would be the newspaper industry generally, for example. I mean, in 1970, if Charlie and I were looking at the newspaper business, we felt it was about as impregnable a franchise as could be found. We still think it's quite a business, but we do not think the franchise in 2002 is the same as it was in 1970. We do not think the franchise of a network television station in 2002 is the same as it was in 1965. And those beliefs change quite gradually, and who knows whether they're precise, whether they're right even, but that is the reason in general that we sell now. If we got into some terribly cheap market, we might sell some things that we thought were cheap to buy something even cheaper after we'd bought lots and lots of equities, but that's not the occasion right now. Charlie?
Nothing to add.
He's been practicing for weeks. Okay, let's go to zone 2.
Good morning. My name is Ted Friedman. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. You said in a 1996 annual report that most investors will find that the best way to own common stocks is in an index fund that charges minimal fees. Two questions. First, there are a lot of different index funds that hold different baskets of stocks. What criteria would you use or recommend to select an appropriate index fund? Second, the price-to-earnings ratio of the S&P 500 is significantly higher than its historical average. What benchmark should an investor use in purchasing this index?
Yeah, I would say that in terms of the index fund, I would just take a very broad index. I would take the S&P 500 as long as I wasn't putting all my money in at one time. If I were going to put money into a index fund in relatively equal amounts over a 20 or 30-year period, I would pick a fund, and I know Vanguard has very low costs. I'm sure there are a whole bunch of others that do. I just haven't looked at the field. But I would be very careful about the costs involved because all they're doing for you is buying that index. I think that the people who buy those index funds on average will get better results than the people that buy funds that have higher costs attached to them, because it's just a matter of math. If you have a very high percentage of funds being institutionally managed, and a great many institutions charge a lot of money for doing it and others charge a little, they're going to get very similar gross results but different net results. And I recommend to all of you reading John Bogle's written a couple of books in the last 5 years, and I can't give you the titles, but they're very good books, and anybody investing in funds should read those books before investing, or if you've already invested, you still should read the books, and it's all you need to know really about fund investing. So I would pick a broad index, but I wouldn't toss a chunk in at any one time. I would do it over a period of time, because the very nature of index funds is that you are saying, I think America's business is going to do reasonably well over a long period of time, but I don't know enough to pick the winners, and I don't know enough to pick the winning times. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't know enough to pick the winning times. Occasionally I think I know enough to pick a winner, but not very often. And I certainly can't pick winners by going down through the whole list and saying this is a winner and this isn't, and so on. So the important thing to do, if you have an overall feeling that business is a reasonable place to have your money over a long period of time, is to invest over a long period of time and not make any bet implicitly by putting a big chunk in at a given time. As to the criteria as to when you should or shouldn't, I don't think there are any great criteria on that. I don't think price-earnings ratio, determines things. I don't think price-book ratios, price-sales ratios. I don't think there's no single metric I can give you, or that anyone else can give you, in my view, that will tell you this is a great time to buy stocks or not to buy stocks or anything of the sort. It just isn't that easy. That's why you go to an index fund, and that's why you buy over a period of time. It isn't that easy. You can't get it by reading a magazine. You can't get it by watching television. You'd love to have something that said, if PEs are 12 or below or some number you buy, and if they're 25 or above you sell. It doesn't work that way. It's a more complex business than that. It couldn't be that easy when you think about it. So if you are buying an index fund, you are protecting yourself against the fact that you don't know the answers to those questions, but that you think you can do well over time without knowing the answers to those questions, as long as you consciously recognize that fact. And I would, if you're a young person and you intend to save a portion of your income over time, I just say pick out a very broad index, and I would probably use the S&P 500, because I think if you start getting beyond that, you starting to think you should be in small caps this time and large caps that time, or this foreign side. And as soon as you do that, you're in a game you don't know. You're not equipped to play in all candor. That would be my recommendation. Charlie?
I think his second worry is that common stocks could become so high-priced that if you bought index funds, you wouldn't expect to do very well. I didn't think I'd live long enough to think that was likely to happen, but now I think that may happen.
But probably what you're saying there is that they could get to a level and they'd have to be at a sustained level like that for a long time.
They could be there and stay there for a long time.
In which case you might make 3 or 4%. But would there be anything way better than that around under those circumstances anyway? And pass the peanut brittle, please.
Well, in Japan, where something like this happened, the return from owning a nice index over the last 13 years or so is negative. Can something as horrible as that happen here? I mean, is it conceivable? I think the answer is yes.
But the option in Japan, of course, is to have deposits in a bank or own Japanese bonds at somewhere between 0 and 1 or 1.5%. So if rates on everything get very low, which means stocks sell very high, then it just means that you live in a different world than existed 20 or 30 years ago when generally capital got paid better.
I must say that we have very good packaging.
Yeah. Yeah. Normally he does this in a less formal manner, but he's on his good behavior today.
We're protecting the integrity of the peanut brittle.
That is true. The package, the nature of anything with butter in it, is it starts going downhill from the moment you make it, and therefore this packaging has to be extraordinary in order to meet the quality standards that Charlie and I insist on. Okay, we'll go to zone 5.
Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger. My name is Thomas Kamei. I'm 12 years old. I live in Kentfield, California. This is my 5th annual meeting. I know you lost a lot of money as a result of 9/11, but I would like to know how 9/11 changed your life and your investment strategy.
Well, I think in the sense of changing the life, it's a good question. And it made everybody, I think, in the country aware. I mean, we've gone through world wars and all of that, and essentially felt quite protected within these borders. And I have been quite worried about, Charlie can attest to, the possibility, particularly of some kind of nuclear device in this country, probably more likely by terrorists than by some at least declared act of war by another state. And 9/11 made everybody realize that as humans have not progressed particularly in terms of how they behave with each other over the years, they have progressed enormously in their ability to inflict damage on those that they hate for one reason or another. And that has increased, for a long time in the world. If you didn't like somebody, the most you could do was throw a rock at them. And that went on for millennia, and then it moved into what you might characterize ironically as more advanced states. And in the last 50 years, it's increased exponentially. And so now people who are megalomaniacs or psychotics or religious fanatics or whatever, and who hate others in some unreasonable way, now have means at their disposal to inflict a whole lot more damage, incredibly more damage than they had not too many decades ago. And 9/11 brought that home to everybody, something they probably understood subconsciously and didn't think about very often, to something they thought about much more intensely, and it's become more real to them. It hasn't really changed my view about it. I mean, in the sense that there are millions and millions and millions of people in the world that hate us, and most of them can't do anything about it. But a few have always tried to do something about it, and now the instruments they can use, and the most extreme in a sense being the human bombs that have appeared in the Middle East, but there's more ability incredibly more ability for the deranged who want to inflict harm to do harm, and that's a reality. In terms of the business aspects of it, the question, obviously, the area at Berkshire that it affects most significantly by miles is insurance. And prior to 9/11, even though we recognized that there could be huge monetary damages that flowed from the activities of what I would call deranged people, we hadn't really written the contracts in such a way as to either get paid for taking that risk or to exclude the risk. In other words, we were throwing it in for nothing. We had excluded risk for war. I mean, we knew that, I mean, we'd seen what had happened in England in the 40s, and so we had taken account of something that some of us had seen with our own eyes, but we didn't take account of something that we knew was possible, but we just hadn't seen. And that's the human condition to some degree. Since September 11th, everybody in the insurance business recognizes that they've had exposures that they weren't charging for, and they either had to exclude those exposures or they had to charge for them. We have written, first thing we had to do, of course, is we had lots of policies on the books that left us exposed to this, and most of those policies ran for a year, starting at different points. Those have run off to a great degree, but they're not entirely run off. The other thing we did was on new policies. We have sold a fair amount, quite a large amount, of terrorism insurance that excludes what we call NCB, nuclear, chemical, and biological, as well as fire following nuclear. And we can take a fair amount of exposure to that sort of terrorism because it won't aggregate. It aggregated at the Twin Towers in a way that, at World Trade Center, in a way that just was about as extreme as you could get for non-NCB type activities. I mean, that was a huge amount of damage done without nuclear, chemical, or biological. But we can have tens of billions of dollars with NCB excluded throughout a greater New York area or something. But we can't have hundreds of billions of exposure that would be exposed, say, to nuclear activities, because they're an act or two or three coordinated could cause damage that would destroy the insurance industry. And if we had coverage on that, it would destroy us as well. So we write very little. We do write a little because we can lose $1 billion or $2 billion, and if we got paid appropriately for taking the risk, that's a business we're in. But we can't lose $50 or $100 billion. And so we take a little bit, we take a few risks that involve nuclear, chemical, or biological. But generally speaking, the terrorism insurance that we're writing, and we've written a fair amount of it, excludes those particular risks. You can say, take biological, how could that be something significant from an insurance standpoint? Well, many people don't realize it, but the World Trade Center loss was by a huge margin the largest workers' compensation loss in history. You think of it as property damage, but in the end, close to 3,000 people died who were working at the time they died and therefore covered by workers' compensation. If the same thing had happened at Yankee Stadium while they were all watching a baseball game or some other place, they wouldn't have been covered by workers' compensation. So it was happenstance to some degree. But that became the largest workers' compensation loss in history by a huge margin. Now, if you were trying to cause huge damage in this country and you could figure out something that in the way of a biological agent, and there are people working on this, that could be injected into the ventilation systems or whatever of large plants, large office buildings, you could create workers' compensation losses that would just totally boggle your mind. And anybody that was working on such a thing, you have to expect they would, if they thought they had perfected it, would try to do something close to simultaneously in areas where there would be thousands and thousands of people working, and it could make the World Trade Center loss look like nothing. So we have to be basically vigilant in how much risk we let aggregate in something of that sort. People have always been vigilant about how many houses they'll insure along a shoreline, or in terms of physical risk. They don't want too many. They don't want too many homes or factories on the San Andreas Fault or something of the sort, because they recognize that as having aggregation possibilities. But now you have to think about things that man may plan in the way of catastrophes that will have aggregation possibilities, and that is something that's pretty much been introduced into the insurance world's thinking since September 11th. And I can tell you, we think a lot about it. I mean, the social consequences are far worse than insurance, but we have to think about how we pay our claims, because if we ever do anything really foolish and take an aggregation that would cause us to lose the net worth of Berkshire, we would not only not be able to pay the claims of the people in that disaster, but there are other people that suffered injuries 15 years ago, paraplegics and all that we're making payments to for the rest of their lifetime, and we wouldn't be able to make those payments, and we're not going to run our business that way. Charlie?
Yeah, to the extent that September 11th has caused us to be less weak, foolish, and sloppy, as we plainly were in facing some plain reality, it's a plus. We regret, of course, what happened, but we should not regret at all that we now face reality with more intelligence. This inconvenience that we all have, this tightening of immigration procedures, etc., should have been done years ago.
The most important thing in investments is not having a high IQ, thank God. I mean, the important thing is realism and discipline. And you don't need to be extraordinarily bright to do well in investments if you are realistic and disciplined. And the same thing applies in insurance underwriting. It is not some arcane science that, the ability to do successfully is given only to a few, or which requires the ability to do mathematics have very little to do with it. There's an understanding of probabilities and all that, kind of a gut understanding that's important, but it does not require the ability to manipulate figures. It does not, you could do it without calculus. You can really do it with a good understanding of arithmetic and an inherent sense of probabilities. And as Charlie says, to the extent that I think we've always, from the investment standpoint, if we've had any distinguishing characteristics, it would be that in terms of realism and discipline. And generally that means defining what you don't know. In insurance underwriting, it's the same thing. You have to be realistic about what you can understand and what you can't understand, and therefore what you can insure and what you can't insure. And you have to be disciplined about turning down all kinds of offerings where you're not getting paid appropriately. And September 11th drove home those lessons and probably redefined getting paid appropriately in certain cases. Area 6.
My question is concerning that what you were just describing as smelling. And I mean, you told us in former shareholder meetings, if management loves money, do not invest. If they love what they do, preferably if they come tap dancing to the office every day, and all other things are right, then invest. That resonated to me very good with the biblical truth that not money itself, but love for money is the root of all evil. And the principle that once made Prussia the largest of all German kingdoms, namely the ethos of doing a job for its own sake. When you tell us in this year's report that you buy a company after talking to the owners for no more than 90 minutes, I'm wondering what kind of, is it the wisdom of experience, just like you described it, or do you do more background work before talking to the owners for 90 minutes? What's the process like? Do you do background checks, or do you talk to competitors? Do the other people in headquarters do that work for you? How does this whole thing work?
Well, it's a very good question, and all of the things you suggest might well make sense. I mean, talking to competitors, talking to ex-employees, talking to current employees, talking to customers, talking to suppliers, all of those things Phil Fisher laid out in a book over 40 years ago, and we have done a fair amount of that over the years. But Charlie would have behaved exactly the same way I did on the company you're referring to. I got a call from Craig Ponzio in December on a Monday. It was about a company that made custom picture frames. I'd never heard of the company before. I'd never heard of Craig before. I didn't talk to him on the phone much more than 15 minutes. He would be here today. His wife became seriously ill, or at least we hope it's not serious, but at least there was a problem last night. But Craig talked to me for maybe 20 minutes, and you can tell when, I mean, it's just all the difference in the world. And he laid out what the custom frame, how the custom frame picture business works. And it's not complicated. I hadn't thought about it for 10 seconds in my whole life up till then. You know, I've had some pictures framed. I get around. But it's not hard. I mean, if you think about it for 30 seconds, the economics of the industry will sort of make themselves manifest to you. There are 18,000 or so framers in the country. It's a small business. So you're dealing with thousands of people. Now, what's important to those thousands of people that you're dealing to? They're doing $250,000 or $300,000 or $400,000 of business a year, and they have customers who come in periodic, like I might come in once every 3 months or every 6 months and say, here, I'd like it framed, and they may ask me about what kind of frame I want, or I may leave it up to them. It's a service operation to a very great degree. And Craig built something starting with, in 1980 or so, with $3 million of sales. He built an organization that became enormously responsive to these 18,000 or so framers. They call on those people 5 or 6 times a year. They get 85% of the frames of those people the next day when they order them. That's what counts in that kind of a business. You know, it's not you're not supplying the big three with auto parts. There's all kinds of things that give it a distinctive economic character. Well, Craig told me about that, like I say, in not more than 20 minutes. And he told me the price, and he told me the capital that was employed, and he gave me a few figures. I knew in talking to him that he had a deal that made sense, you know. And I said, when can you come in? That was on a Monday. He said, I'll be there Wednesday morning. And he came with Steve McKenzie, who is here today, and who I encourage you to meet. And I think they got there at 9 and they left at 10:30, and we'd shaken hands. I was hoping to see Craig today or tomorrow, but I won't because of this illness. But I haven't seen Craig since. You know, I mean, he got this money. He knew he was making a deal. He had a reason why he wanted to sell it to somebody that would be sure to close, that would be a good owner, where the people who worked there wouldn't be worried because he was leaving. He was leaving with a lot of money, and you know, he wanted to be sure. A lot of people leave with a lot of money and they leave the employees behind and they don't care what happens. But this guy cared, and I could tell that, and that's a big plus with me. So, you know, I have not been to their headquarters yet. I plan to be to their headquarters. Steve, I apologize. But I understand what the business is about. And you can most good businesses, you can understand what they're about in a very few minutes, unless they're a kind of business that you never can understand what they're about. I mean, there are other businesses, if you spent years on them, you still wouldn't understand what the hell's going on. I don't know which American auto company is going to do the best 10 years from now. And if I spent all year talking to dealers for Ford and Chrysler and General Motors, and I talked to suppliers, and I talked to people who are driving their cars, I still wouldn't know anything about what it's going to look like 5 or 10 years from now. But I know that you can't crack our custom picture frame business. I mean, you cannot figure out a way to call on those 18,000 people that are in that business and figure out a way to divert their business to you when you can't offer a frame as good as ours and you can't offer service remotely like ours. So it's a good business. And then and Craig was 100% up. I mean, he told me exactly what he wanted to receive for the business. He wanted cash. You know, that fits us. And there's nothing complicated about it. I mean, you can drag it out for a long time, but what would be the sense of it? I mean, it's just going to make a deal. You're going to make a deal. Charlie?
Yeah. If you stop to think about it, the ordinary result when a big publicly held corporation buys another corporation is that maybe 2/3 of the time it's a terrible deal for the buying corporation, and yet the people have taken enormous time doing it. And we've bought all these businesses taking practically no time in doing it, and on average they've worked out wonderfully. Why is that? That's a good question. The answer is we wait for the no-brainers. We're not trying to do the difficult
we're
things.
Equipped for those.
And, yeah. And we have the patience to wait. And then we're so peculiar that there actually are a good number of businesses in America where they prefer selling to us than to other people. That's very helpful.
I just saw a review of a major company that made 10 acquisitions in a recent 5-year period. Every one of those 10 acquisitions was preceded by due diligence and all the baloney they go through, and they probably had an investment banker's book and everything. Not one of the 10 in 2001 lived up or was even close to the expectation of the presentation that was made at the time of purchase. In aggregate, the 10 earned 1/4 of what they were projected to earn in 2001. In other words, the projections were for 4 times the actual earnings. And these were companies with strategic, this is a company with a strategic, acquisition department with loads of people to go over the due diligence, with investment bankers, quote, helping them, end quote, all along the way. And 10 out of 10 failed miserably. And, you have to ask yourself, how can you produce that? Because the world didn't go to hell during that period either. I mean, that was not a time when we went into a Great Depression or anything of the sort. They were buying what was getting sold to them, and it was fulfilling some things that myths that the management had about itself. And managements have many myths about themselves. And it isn't that complicated if you just wait for the fat pitch. And the fat pitch doesn't have to be somebody else doing something dumb or anything like that, because people don't do that. The people that come to us come for a good reason. I mean, they usually want a transaction. They want one they're sure to close. They want, if a deal is made, and they want one that will leave the people happy that are at the business. When it was announced at Johns Manville, I believe that Berkshire was the buyer. I understand there was a standing ovation, and I've seen it at, whether it's Jordan's or Star Furniture. People are concerned. If you've been working in a company for 20 years and you know that the owning family is getting older and has some problems to take care of, believe me, they talk in the hallways about that. What's going to happen when, the family sells the place? And people worry about that. And to have an answer for them so that they all sleep the night that it's announced that the business has changed hands means a lot to some owners, and it doesn't mean anything to other owners. I don't think we've ever bought a business from a financial operator. Can you think of any, Charlie?
I can't think of one. No. Somebody once defined hell in a legal system as a place with endless due process and no justice, and we're getting close. And similarly, in the corporate world, if you have endless due diligence and no horse sense, you've just described a corporate hell, at least for the people who own the business.
Go back to Zone 1.
Good morning. My name is Pamela Harrington, and I live here in Omaha, Nebraska. And my question concerns your investment in Fruit of the Loom. Could you talk about how that investment fits in with your philosophy about turnaround situations and your preference for businesses that have barriers to entry? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Fruit of the Loom got in trouble for 2 reasons. One is they borrowed too much money. They borrowed about $1.2 billion, and actually it went something beyond that because they were engaging some other transactions that were off balance sheet and so on. So it was a company that in a financial sense was out of control. Simultaneously with that, they had a lot of operating problems too. But we were not going to inherit the capital structure, and we were not going to inherit the management that had caused the operating problems, but much to our pleasure, we were going to inherit a management that had done an incredible job in running the business for a long time prior to the sins of the recent period. And we made a condition. I don't think there's probably ever been a condition made to a bankruptcy court or a proposal where we said our offer is not contingent on financing. It's not contingent on, if war breaks out, our offer is still good and everything else. But we did make a contingent on John Holland being available to run the business, because John had done a sensational job of running the business before the difficulties of the excess leverage and operating insanities. And he was willing to come back, which was very important to us. And Fruit of the Loom has, I don't know, between 40 and 45% of the men's and boys market. It's a product that has a deserved quality image. It's accepted in a big way by very important retailers who were disturbed by things that took place prior to and early in the bankruptcy, but who love the idea of having a product like Fruit of the Loom in their stores. And it's a very low-cost producer of a very basic product. So it fits us very well. And now the management can just simply worry about building the brand and running plants as efficiently as possible. And there's been some rearrangement of plants as has happened throughout many things connected with textiles. But it's an absolutely first-class business, and we'd like to get a little more share in the women's market. We'd like to get a little more share in the men's and boys market too. But it's made to order for us. But it's only made to order with the present management. If we'd had to take on the management that was there for a few years, we wouldn't have bought it for $1. It would have been a disaster, and it was a disaster for a while. But fortunately, it's a little like Geico in the mid-70s. I mean, Geico was a marvelous company that got mismanaged in a big way for a while. But its fundamental advantages were there throughout the period, and what you had to do was get rid of the mismanagement and get back to the basics. Charlie?
Yeah, I don't have anything on that subject, but I neglected to answer the question about what books would we recommend. The two books that I recommend this year were both sent to me by Berkshire shareholders who thought I might like them, and boy, were they right. The first is called Ice Age, which is a description of the past history of glaciation in the last few 100,000 years and how they figured out what had happened and why it had happened. And I think it's the best book of scientific explanation I have ever read. It's been published in England, and it's going to be published in the United States this fall. And the airport has like 20 copies, T.D. Waterhouse, which they did by scrounging all of Canada. And so I recommend that book to you, but a lot of you are going to have to wait for the fall, I think. The other book was How the Scots Have Helped Create the Modern World. That's a subject that always interested me, how a tiny, poor little population of Celtic people had such a huge favorable impact on the world, starting from poverty. And of course, it's related to the Irish, who were a similar ethnic strain with a different religion. And it was a marvelous book, and I forget the author's name, but I recommend both of those books to all of you.
Yeah, I'll recommend a book which may sound a little self-serving, but nevertheless, I think this group, many of you would enjoy reading about the Berkshire managers. And Bob Miles has brought out a book, and it tells about the people who are handling your capital. And I don't think you could have I know you couldn't have a better group. So therefore, if you feel like reading about them, Bob has done a good job of interviewing them, and I would encourage you to read about them. And I think you'll like your investment better after you read about the managers than if you just read what Charlie and I write. Let's go back to zone 1.
Hello, Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger. My name is Justin Fong, and I am 12 years old from California. This is my second consecutive year in attendance. My parents brought me here to learn from you. My question is not about money. It's about friendship. How do you remain friends and business partners for so long? And what advice do you have for young people like me in selecting true friends and future business partners? Thank you.
No one. Well, when Charlie and I met in 1959, we were introduced by the Davis family, and they predicted that within 30 minutes we would either not be able to stand each other or we'd get along terrifically. And that was a fairly insightful analysis, actually, by the Davises, because you had two personalities that both had some tendencies toward dominance in certain situations. But we hit it off. We have disagreed, but we have never had an argument that I can remember at all in 43 years. And yet we both have strong opinions, and they aren't the same strong opinions at times. But the truth is, we've had an enormous amount of fun together. We continue to have an enormous amount of fun. And nothing will change that, basically. It may have worked better because he's in California and I'm in Omaha. I don't know. I'll let Charlie comment on it.
Well, that's a wonderful question you've asked, because Warren and I both know some very successful businessmen who have not one true friend on earth, and rightly so.
That's true.
And that is no way to live a life. And if by asking that question you're asking, how do I get the right friends, you are really onto the right question. And when you get with the right friends, if you've worked hard at becoming the right sort of fellow, I think you'll recognize what you have, and then all you have to do is hang on.
Yeah. The real question, the question is, what do you like in other people? I mean, what do you want from a friend? And if you'll think about it, there's certain qualities that you admire in other people, that you find likable, that you and cause you to want to be around certain people. And then look at those qualities and say to yourself, which of these is it physically or mentally impossible for me to have? And the answer will be none. I mean, it's only reasonable that if certain things attract you to other people, that if you possess those, they will attract other people to you. And secondarily, if you find certain things repulsive in other people, whether they brag or they're dishonest or whatever it may be, if that turns you off, it's going to turn other people off if you possess those qualities. And those are choices. Very few of those things, are in your DNA. They are choices, and they are also habits. I mean, if you have habits that attract people early on, you'll have them later on. And if you have habits that repel people, you're not going to cure it when you're 60 or 70. So it is not a complicated equation. And as I remember, Ben Franklin did something like that one time, didn't he? List the qualities he admired and then just set out to acquire them.
Absolutely. Yeah. He went at it the way you've gone after acquiring money.
They're not mutually exclusive.
No.
Hello, Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger. My name is Kevin Truitt, and I'm a shareholder from Chicago, Illinois. This question is for you, Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger. Mr. Buffett, I followed your career since I first read about you in the first edition of the Forbes 400 that came out in '82. Reading your profile also led me to Ben Graham's book, The Intelligent Investor. Since that time, I have also followed the careers of other successful investors such as Walter Schloss, Bill Ruane, Richard Rainwater, Robert Bass, and Edward Lampert. In following your career and the careers of these other highly successful investors, it's my observation and my firm belief that despite their obvious high level of intelligence and some of them having gone to some of the best schools in the country, none of these people, including yourself, were born great investors. Every one of these, including yourself, learned to be a great investor. Graham learned from his experience. You, Bill Ruane, Walter Schloss, learned from Graham. Richard Rainwater learned from you, Phil Fisher, and Charlie Allen, and from reading Graham. Robert Bass, and Ed Lampert learned from Richard Rainwater and most likely from reading Graham and Fisher as well. These observations lead me to the conclusion that despite intellectual brilliance, although that probably helps, I've come to the conclusion that great investors are made, not born. Do you and Mr. Munger agree with this conclusion? If so, why? If not, why not? And if you do agree, what things would you recommend that someone do if they wanted to become a great investor? Also, what mental attributes do you think a person should have if they want to try to become a great investor? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I largely agree with what you said. I would say that I don't know to what extent an ability to detach yourself from the crowd, for example. I don't know to what extent that's innate or to what extent that's learned, but that's a quality you need. I would agree totally with you that a great IQ is not needed. I mean, you do not have to be terrifically smart to do well as an investor at all. I would say you're 100% right that I learned from Graham first in a very, very big way, and I learned something additionally from Phil Fisher, and I learned a lot from Charlie. And the proof is in my record, actually. From 11 to 19, I was reading Garfield Drew and Edwards and McGee and all kinds of, I mean, I read every book, Gerald M. Loeb. I mean, I read every book there was on investments, and I didn't do well at all. And I had no real investment philosophy. I had a lot of things I tried. I was having a lot of fun. I wasn't making any money. And I read Ben's book in 1949 or 49 when I was at the University of Nebraska, and that actually just changed my whole view of investing. And really, it basically told me to think about a stock as a part of a business. Now, that seems so obvious. You can say, you know, that why should you regard that as the Rosetta Stone? But it is a Rosetta Stone in a sense. Once you crank into your mental apparatus that you're not looking at things that wiggle up and down on charts or that people send you little missives on, you know, saying buy this because it's going up next week or it's going to split or the dividend's going to get increased or whatever. But instead you're buying a business that you've now set a foundation for going on and thinking rationally about investing. And there's no reason why you need a high IQ to do that. There's no reason why you have to be born in some way. I do think there's certain manners of temperament that may be innate, and they may be learned, they may be intensified by experience as you go on, partially innate, but then reinforced in various ways by your experience as you go through life. But that's enormously important. I mean, you have to be realistic. You have to just define your circle of competence accurately. You have to know what you don't know and not get enticed by it. You can't be, you have to have an interest in money, I think, or you won't be good at investing. But I think if you're very greedy, it'll be a disaster because that will overcome rationality. But I think the same books I read and really molded how I thought about businesses and investing, I think that they're just as valid now. I mean, I haven't seen anything in the last 25 years, and I glanced through most of the books anyway. I've seen nothing to improve on Graham and Fisher in terms of the basic approach of going about investing, which is to think about stocks as businesses and then think about what makes a good business. And really, that's all there is to investing and having a margin of safety, which Ben talks about, and so on. It's not a complicated process, but it definitely requires discipline. It requires insulating yourself from popular opinion. You simply can't pay any attention to it. It just doesn't mean anything. So you can't. The idea of listening to lots of people tell you things and all that, it's just a waste of time. And you know, you'd be better off just sitting and thinking a little bit. I mean, there were no analyst reports on custom frame makers. You know, it just doesn't, and they wouldn't have been any good anyway. You have to think, but you have to think about them as in terms of their business characteristics and what they can earn on capital employed and that sort of thing. I would just read I would read the Graham and the Phil Fisher books and then read lots of annual reports, think about businesses, and try and think about which businesses you understand and which you don't understand. And you don't have to understand them all. Just forget about the ones that you don't understand. Charlie?
Yeah, at a deeper level of generality, if you have a passionate interest in knowing why things are happening, you always are trying to figure out the world in terms of why is this happening or why is this not happening. That cast of mind kept over long periods gradually improves your ability to cope with reality. And if you don't have that cast of mind, I think you're destined probably for failure, even if you've got a pretty high IQ.
Yeah, I would say we've seen relatively little correlation between investment results and IQ. I mean, not that there are a whole bunch of people out there with 80 IQs that are knocking, the cover off the ball, but there are all kinds of people with high IQs that get no place. And it's probably, in a sense, it's more interesting to look at why people with high IQs don't succeed and then sort of cast out those factors and see if you can cast them out in yourself and leave a residual that will work. Because if it's like Charlie always says, all I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there. So if you study the people who die financially, with high IQs and say, why do they die? You'll see certain overwhelming characteristics that are present in most of the cases. And you just got to make sure that either you don't possess them, or if you do possess them, that you can get rid of them or control them in some manner. Area 3.
Good morning, Mr. Buffett, Mr. Munger. My name is Jerry McLaughlin. I'm from San Mateo, California. First, I just want to thank you for all the effort you put into the annual reports, the letters, and these conversations. I've learned a lot, and they're terrific, which is why I'm here from half a country away.
Thank you.
You've said that great companies are those that have an economic moat. And I understand that phrase to mean a sustainable competitive advantage. Do businesses begin their lives with sustainable competitive advantages, or must that be developed over a very long time? And then, what are the fundamental bases upon which you've seen companies successfully develop sustainable competitive advantages? Of those, which do you think is the most enduring and which is the least?
Well, sometimes they can develop it very quickly. I mean, I would say that Microsoft, in terms of the operating system, that was a relatively quick development. But that was an industry that was exploding and things were changing very fast. On the other hand, if you go back to See's Candy, which started in 1921, there is no way you could build a sustainable competitive advantage, at least that would be recognizable in times measured shorter than decades. I mean, you opened up one shop at a time and nobody had heard of you originally, and then a few people did. And boxed chocolates were something that people may have bought once or twice a year for holiday occasions or whatsoever. So you weren't going to embed yourself in the minds of Californians in 1 or 2 or 5 years just because you were turning out an outstanding box of chocolates. So it depends on the way the industry itself is developing. Walmart has done a fabulous job an incredible job in quite a short period of time. But even they took it in the small towns and they progressed along and refined their techniques as they went. But I would say that there could be things in new industries. I would say with NetJets, we have a sustainable competitive advantage, and that's an industry that was only originated in 1986 when Rich Santulli got the idea, and it was in its total infancy for a good many years after that. But what he has built is building and fortifying is that sustainable competitive advantage. But it depends very much on the industry you were in. And I mean, Coca-Cola, 1886, Jacobs Pharmacy, Atlanta, Georgia, John Pemberton came up with a product. Did he have a sustainable competitive advantage that day? If he did, he blew it because he sold the place for $2,000 to He's a gambler. He did, and it took decades, thousands of competitors over that time, and but they were painting one barn at a time and designing one Saturday Evening Post ad at a time, and all of that, and Pebbles, around the world in World War II. General Eisenhower went to Mr. Woodruff and he said, I want a Coke within the arm's length of every American serviceman. He said, I want something to remind him of home. And so he built a lot of bottling plants for Coke around the world. And, that was a huge impetus, but that was what, 60 years or so after the product was invented. So it takes a long time in certain kinds of products, but I could see certain areas of the world where a huge competitive advantage was built in a very short period of time. I would say that probably in terms of animated feature-length films, for example, Walt Disney did that, and after Snow White and a few more, it took him a while till it could cash in on it. But it became Disney and nobody else in that field for quite a while, and fairly quickly. Charlie?
Yeah, there are a lot of different models that create a sustainable competitive advantage, and there are also some models of where you can lose it very fast. You just ask Arthur Andersen. That was a very good name in America not very long ago, and I think it would be harder to lose the good name of Wrigley's Gum than the good name of Arthur Andersen. I think there's some perfectly remarkable competitive advantages that people have gotten over time. And the great trouble with the investment process is that they're so damned obvious that the stocks sell at very high prices.
Snickers has been the #1 candy bar for probably 30 or 40 years now.
Yeah, in Russia, it turns out everybody likes Snickers.
Yeah. How do you really knock it off? I mean, we make candy. We would love to displace Snickers, but it's hard to think of ways to knock them from the #1 spot. I mean, my guess is that they'll be #1 in 10 years from now in candy bars, and the list doesn't change much in that field because if you think about the nature of how you make that choice as to what candy bar. If you were chewing spearmint chewing gum 5 years ago and you buy a pack of some chewing gum today, it's likely to be spearmint. I mean, there's things that you experiment a lot with, and there are things that you don't fool around with once you're happy. And you can understand that if you observe your own habits and people's habits around you. But there's usually if something can gain competitive advantage very quickly, you have to worry about them losing it quickly too. I mean, when an industry is in flux, there are a lot of people that think they're the survivors or the ones that are going to prosper where it turns out otherwise. Area 5.
Okay, my name's Paul Tomasic from Illinois. I'd like to talk about your thinking, if you don't mind. In the Fortune magazine article that you sent to all the shareholders, you referenced a practice by Darwin that when he found something that was contrary to his established conclusions, he quickly wrote it down because the mind would have pushed it out. And if you read The Origin of Species, Darwin's very careful to avoid fooling himself. He very carefully asks and answers the hard questions. It's a feedback mechanism, and you've picked up on one of his feedback mechanisms to avoid fooling yourself. So the two questions are this. If you model how you think, Charlie thinks, how physicists think, how mathematicians think, you see the same pattern. You want to use logic. You're dedicated to logic, but logic's not enough. You have to avoid fooling yourself. So you build feedback mechanisms. So the first question is, do you see it that way? That you're thinking just like mathematicians, physicists, and some of the other exceptional businessmen, by being logical and being careful to have feedback mechanisms. And the second question is about other feedback mechanisms. Your partnership, sitting next to you, is a great feedback mechanism. It's hard to fool yourself when you partner with Charlie Munger.
Right.
This meeting's a feedback
Hard to fool him, too.
But that's not an accident. The meeting, on one level, is a feedback mechanism. The way you attack the annual report letter is a feedback mechanism. So could you comment, both of you, on other feedback mechanisms you developed? Thank you.
Well, you've come up with two very good ones. I mean, there's no question that Charlie will not accept anything I say because I say it, whereas a lot of other people will. You know, I mean, it's just the way the world works. And it's terrific to have a partner who will say, you know, you're not thinking straight.
Doesn't happen very often.
There's no question the human mind, that what the human being is best at doing is interpreting all new information so that their prior conclusions remain intact. I mean, that is a talent everyone seems to have mastered. And how do we guard ourselves against it? Well, we don't achieve it perfectly. I mean, Charlie and I have made big mistakes because, in effect, we have been unwilling to look afresh at something. You know, that happens. But we do have, I think the annual report is a good feedback mechanism. I think that reporting on yourself, and particularly if you can report honestly, whether you do it through an annual report or do it through some other mechanism, is very useful. But I would say a partner who is not subservient and who himself is extremely logical, you know, is probably the best mechanism you can have. I would say that on the contrary, to get back to looking things you have to be sure you don't fall into, I would say the typical corporate organization is designed so that the CEO opinions and biases and previous beliefs are reinforced in every possible way. I mean, having staffs around you that know what you want to do, you are not going to get a lot of you're getting a lot of contrary thinking. I mean, most staffs, if they know you want to buy a company, you're going to get a recommendation. Whatever your hurdle rate, if it's 15% internal rate of return, which very few deals ever work out at, you know, or 12, or they're going to come back and they're going to come back with whatever they feel that you want. And if you arrange your organization so that you basically have a bunch of you know, sycophants who are cloaked in other, you know, titles, you're not going to get. You're going to leave your prior conclusions intact, and you're going to get whatever you go in with your biases wanting, and the board is not going to be much of a check on that. I've seen very, very few boards that can stand up to the CEO on something that's important to the CEO and just say, you know, you're not going to get it. So you've hit on a terribly important point. That, you know, all of us in this room want to read new information and have it confirm our cherished beliefs. I mean, it is just built into the human system. And that can be very expensive in the investment and business world. And like I say, I think we've got a pretty good system. And I think that most of the systems aren't very good that exist in corporate America to avoid falling in the trap you're talking about. Charlie?
Yeah, I think it also helps to be willing to reverse course, even when it's quite painful. As we sit here, I think Berkshire is the only big corporation in America that is running off a derivative book. And we originally made the decision to allow the General Re derivative book to continue. It's a very unpleasant thing to do, to reverse that decision, yet we're perfectly willing to do it. Nobody else is doing it, and yet it's perfectly obvious, at least to me, that to say that derivative accounting in America is a sewer is an insult to sewage.
Yeah. I would second that. I might not have chosen those exact words, and we may not even use those words in describing why we got out of it. But yeah, and in the first quarter of this year, we'll show quite a bit of income. And anything we say here, we ought to put on the internet, Mark. But I think we'll show what, 60 million or something like that of financial, or maybe it's 140. I'll take a look here. We'll have 160 odd million of income in that funny little line we have from financial income. But that will be after an $88 million loss in terms of getting the first steps of getting out of the General Re, what used to be called General Re Financial Products derivative book. You know, those losses were there. I mean, some of that is the shutdown loss, 30 million or thereabouts is severance pay and that sort of thing. But the truth is that derivative accounting is absolutely terrible in this country, and there are a lot of companies that will not want to face up to what would be involved if they actually got out. Now you're seeing derivative accounting unwound at Enron in a very major way. And believe me, it's not being unwound at a profit, except to the extent that the bankruptcy court lets them disaffirm certain contracts. And I mean, it is that there was no place where there was as much potential for phonying numbers at a place like Enron than in the derivative country. They were marking to model. They were doing all these things. You give a whole bunch of traders the ability to create income by putting little numbers down on a piece of paper that nobody can really check, and it can get out of control. It will get out of control. And so we decided finally to bite the bullet on it. And we get out of it, and it would, incidentally, we would not have reported $88 million of loss if we'd stayed in it. Might have reported a tiny profit or something, but in the end, the loss was there, and there could well be some more to come in that, because once you get into derivatives, I think our longest contract may run 40 years or something like that. And then, the guy who put the 40-year contract on the book probably got paid, that week for putting it on virtually. And, we've got a bunch of assumptions as to how it's all going to work out over 40 years. You couldn't devise a worse system. And in the end, we didn't want to be in the business when we got in it. And we are now in the process of getting out. But you don't get out fast of something like this. I mean, it's a little like hell. It's easy to get into, and it's very hard to get out of. Well, with that, we'll go off to lunch, and I'll see you here in another half hour or so. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Perlman from Toronto, Canada. Mr. Buffett, in 1998, you were asked to comment on the pharmaceutical industry, and at that time, your answer was that you considered it a mistake not to have taken a basket approach to the industry. I was wondering if you could revisit the issue now that valuations have contracted so dramatically, and also considering that healthcare spending is outpacing inflation and that there are significant moats in the industry. I was wondering if you could share with us your thoughts on the healthcare industry at large.
Well, Charlie may be better equipped on that than I am, but certainly it's been, as an industry, a very, very good business over time. I mean, if you take the aggregate capital in it and what it's earned over time, it's been a very good business. And we did make a mistake. Your memory's 100% accurate, and what we said earlier meetings, because we should have taken a package approach. We actually did buy a tiny, tiny bit, but that's worse than buying none almost. I mean, it's just aggravating. Back there in '93, they're certainly the kind of businesses that, as an industry, we can understand. We would not have great insights on specific companies, so if we did something, we would be more inclined to do it on an industry-wide basis. It's hard to evaluate the individual companies. As you know, Bristol-Myers has recently had a big stumble, and even Merck has fallen back, and so it's hard to pick the winners. But that's no reason not to have a basket approach to the industry, and at some valuation level, it would be something we would think very hard about, and it's something where we could put quite a bit of money if it happened, which is another plus to us. Charlie?
Well, having failed to get it right the last time, we'll probably fail to get it right the next time.
I don't know what he had for lunch. Okay, we'll go to number one.
Dear Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger, my name is Adrian Chern. I'm a shareholder from Hong Kong. Thank you for your leadership and inspiration as always. It's wonderful always listening to you. If I may, I would like to ask of you both, gentlemen, a question in two parts. Perhaps I can ask the second part after you've answered the first part. The first part of the question relates to the Fortune article dated 10th of December you included in our shareholder materials. In this article, you mentioned that one couldn't explain the remarkable divergence in markets by differences in the growth of GNP. However, one could explain the divergence by interest rates. The first question I have is this. I wonder, sir, if you were to look at the price of gold during the two periods of times you mentioned, that is to say 1948-64 and 64-81, if the explanation could be even more clear. Thus, the logical reason would be why the Dow in 48 was 177 was because, and half the level of 1929 is 381 index points, is because of the 71% devaluation of the American dollar from 20.5 cents an ounce to 35 cents an ounce, which would put the fair value of the Dow at 166, after factoring in the record 50% per capita gain of the 1940s that you had mentioned.
Yeah, I grew up in a household, and my sisters are here, where gold was talked about frequently. So I've been exposed to a lot of thinking on that over the years. I don't really think gold has really, the price of gold, I should say, has anything really to do with the valuation of businesses. It may reflect certain things that are going on in prices attached to those businesses at given times, but I would not regard, I mean, the price of gold does not enter into my thinking in any way, shape, or form in terms of how I value a business today, a year ago, 10 years ago, or tomorrow. When we look at Larson Jewels, the custom picture frame operation, you know, I'm not thinking of that and relating it in any way to what gold has done. So it's just not a factor with us any more than other commodities would be. I mean, you know, whether it's wheat, whether it's cocoa beans or whatever, it has, you know, it has a certain hold on some people, and but we don't look at it as an interesting investment, and we don't look at it as a yardstick for valuing other investments. Charlie?
Yeah, Warren is right when he says that interest rates are very important in determining the value of stocks generally. And I think he's also right when he says gold is very unimportant.
The second part of the question?
Thank you, sir. The second part of my question is this. Given your assumptions on gold, if you were to factor a significant decline in the value of the dollar against gold, let's say 40% or more, and given the correlation of 1929-48 and 64-81 eras positively to the decline of the dollar, and the negative correlation in the other two areas that you had studied, would you care to adjust the 7% total annual return you were quoted as expecting for common equity in the coming decade? And in conjunction with that, would you care to comment on your expected rate of return on all other major asset classes, perhaps like bonds, real estates, and which would you believe offers the best value for investors?
Yeah, well,
thank you very much.
Except under unusual circumstances, my expected rate, my expectancy on something like bonds is what bonds are producing at a given time. I don't think I'm smarter than the bond market. Now, you can say, when those rates swing all over, does that mean I swing all over? The answer is pretty close to yes. I mean, I don't know what the right rate for bonds is. I think that if there's, I'm very leery of economic correlations. I mean, I spent years fooling around with that sort of thing, and I mean, I correlated stock prices with everything in the world, and the problem was when I found a correlation. I mean, it's you've seen these things on whether the AFC or the NFL wins the Super Bowl and all that sort of thing. You can find something that correlates with something else, but in the end, a business or any economic asset is going to be worth what it produces in the way of cash over its lifetime. And if you own an oil field, if you own a farm, if you own an apartment house, with the oil field, it's the life of the oil field and what you can get out of it. And maybe you get secondary recovery, maybe you get tertiary recovery. Well, whatever it may be, it's worth the discounted value of the oil that's going to come out. And then you have to make an estimate as to volume and as to price. With a farm, you make an estimate as to crop yield and costs and crop prices. And the apartment house, you make an estimate as to rentals and operating expenses and how long it'll last and when people will build other new apartment houses that potential renters in the future will find preferable and so on. But all investment is laying out some money now to get more money back in the future. Now, there's two ways of looking at getting the money back. One is from what the asset itself will produce. That's investment. One is from what somebody else will pay you for it later on, irrespective of what the asset produces, and I call that speculation. So if you are looking to the asset itself, you don't care about the quote because the asset is going to produce the money for you. And that's what society as a whole is going to get from investing in that asset. Then there's the other way of looking at it is what somebody will pay you tomorrow for it, even if it's valueless. And that's speculation. And of course, society gets nothing out of that eventually, but one group profits at the expense of another. And of course, you had that operate in a huge way in the bubble of a few years ago. You had all kinds of things that were going to produce nothing, but where you had great amounts of wealth transfer in the short term. As investments, they were a disaster. As means of wealth transfer, they were terrific for certain people, and they were for the other people that were on the other side of the wealth transfer. They were disasters. We looked solely. We don't care whether something's quoted because we don't buy it with the idea of selling it to somebody. We look at what the business itself will produce. We bought See's Candy in 1972. The success of that has been because of the cash it's produced subsequently. It's not based on the fact I call up somebody at a brokerage house every day and say, what's my See's Candy stock worth? And that is our approach to anything. On interest rates, I'm no good. I bought some REITs a couple of years ago because I thought they were undervalued. Why did I think they were undervalued? Because I thought they could produce 11 or 12% in terms of the assets that those companies had, and I thought an 11 or 12% return was attractive. Now the REITs are selling at higher prices, and they're not as attractive as they were then. But you just look at every asset class, every business, every farm, every REIT, whatever it may be, and say, what is this thing likely to produce over time? And that's what it's worth. It may sell at vastly different prices from time to time, but that just means one person is profiting against another, and that's not our game. Charlie?
Yeah, what makes common stock prices so hard to predict is that a general liquid market for common stocks creates from time to time, either in sectors of the market or in the whole market, a Ponzi scheme. In other words, you have an automatic process where people get sucked in and other people come in because it worked last month or last year, and it can build to perfectly ridiculous levels, and the levels can last for considerable periods. Trying to predict that kind of thing, sort of a Ponzi scheme, which is, if you will, accidentally thrown into the valuation of common stocks by just the forces of life, by definition, that's going to be very, very hard to predict. That's what makes it so dangerous to short stocks, even when they're grossly overvalued. It's hard to know just how overvalued they can become in addition to the overvaluation that exists. And I don't think you're going to predict the Ponzi scheme effect in markets by looking at the price of gold or any other correlation.
Charlie and I mean, you're pulling a figure out of the air. We have probably agreed on at least 100 companies, maybe more, that we felt were frauds, you know, bubble type things. And if we'd acted on shorting those over the years, we might be broke now. But we were right on probably just about 100 out of 100. It's very hard to predict how far what Charlie calls the Ponzi scheme will go. It's not exactly a scheme in the sense that it isn't concocted, in most cases, by one. It's sort of a natural phenomenon that seems to nursed along by promoters and investment bankers and venture capitalists and so on. But they don't all sit in a room and work it out. It plays on human nature in certain ways, and it creates its own momentum, and eventually it pops. You know, and nobody knows when it's going to pop, and that's why you can't short. At least we don't find it makes good sense to short those things. But it is recognizable. You know when you're dealing with those kind of crazy things, but you don't know how high they'll go or when it'll end or anything else. And people who think they do, you know, sometimes play in it, and other people know how to take advantage of it. I mean, there's no question about that. You do not have to have a 200 IQ to see a period like that and figure out how to have a big wealth transfer from somebody else to you. You know, and that was done on a huge scale, you know, in recent years. It's not the most admirable aspect of capitalism. Area 4.
Good afternoon. My name is Bob Baden from Rochester, New York. Mr. Munger, this morning while discussing index funds, you used the example of Japan as a real example of poor performance of a major index over a long period. Indeed, the S&P 500 index declined over 60% in real terms from the early 60s through the mid-70s. Could you discuss the mental models you use to consider the impact of inflation or deflation on your investment decisions and the likelihood of either occurring over the next decade?
Well, that's partly easy and partly tough. If interest rates are going to go way up, you can obviously have a lot of deflation of stock prices. And a lot of that happened in the American period you're talking about. What's interesting about Japan is that I don't think anybody thought that a major modern Keynesian democracy pervaded by a good culture in terms of engineering, product quality, product innovation, and so forth, could have a period where you would have negative 13 years without major depression either. I think that and that it would occur while interest rates were going down, not up. I think that was so novel that the models of the past totally failed to predict it. But I think these anomalies are always very interesting. And I think it's crazy for Americans to assume that what's happening in Argentina and what has happened in Japan are totally inconceivable forever in America. They are not totally inconceivable.
You had a huge bubble in equity prices in Japan, and now you've had interest rates go to virtually nothing. You've had the passage of time. The country hasn't disappeared. People are going to work every day, and you've had the Nikkei, you know, now at a third of what it sold for not that many years ago. It's an interesting phenomenon.
And huge fiscal stimulus in the whole period from the government.
Post-bubble periods, I think, depending on how big the bubble is, and how many were participating in it, but post-bubble periods, I think, can produce fallout that not everyone will be terribly good at predicting.
Hi, I'm Steve Rosenberg. I'm 22 from Ann Arbor, Michigan. It's a privilege to be here. First, I'd just like to thank you both for serving as a hero and positive role model for me and many others. Much more than your success itself, I respect your unparalleled integrity. If you could comment on the A.W. Jones model, the long-short equity model. I understand that it doesn't make sense for capital the size of Berkshire's to take that type of a strategy, but it just seems to me that playing the short side in combination also seems incredibly compelling, even given the inherent structural and mathematical disadvantages of shorting. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why you would have lost money on your basket of 100 frauds.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and we'll go in reverse order. Many people think of A.W. Jones, who was a fortune writer at one time, and who developed the best known hedge fund, whenever it was in the early 60s or thereabouts, maybe the late 50s even. And for some of the audience, the idea originally with A.W. Jones is that they would go long and short more or less equal amounts and have a market neutral fund, so that it didn't make any difference which way the market went. They didn't really stick with that over time, and I'm not even sure whether A.W. Jones said that they would, but sometimes they'd be 140% long and 80% short, so they'd have a 60% net long or whatever it might be. They were not market neutral throughout the period, but they did operate on the theory of being long stocks that seemed underpriced and short stocks that were overpriced. Even the Federal Reserve, in a report they made on the long-term capital management situation a few years ago, credited A.W. Jones with being sort of the father of this theory of hedge funds. As Mickey Newman, if he's still here, knows, I think it was in 1924 that Ben Graham set up the Benjamin Graham Fund, which was designed exactly along those lines, and which even used paired securities. In other words, he would look at General Motors and Chrysler and decide which he thought was undervalued relative to the other and go long one and short the other. So the idea, and he was paid a percentage of the profits, and it had all today's hedge funds, except it was started in 1924. And I don't know that Ben was the first on that, but I know that he was 30 years ahead of the one that the Federal Reserve credited with being the first, and that many people still talk about as being the first A.W. Jones. Ben did not find that particularly successful, and he even wrote about it some in terms of the problems he encountered with that approach. And my memory is that a quite high percentage of the paired investments worked out well. He was right. The undervalued one went up and the overvalued, or the spread between the two, narrowed. But the one time out of four or whatever it was that he was wrong, lost a lot more money than the average of the three that he was right on. And all I can say is that I've shorted stocks in my life and had one particularly harrowing experience in 1954. And I can hardly think of a situation where I was wrong if viewed from 10 years later, but I can think of some ones where I was certainly wrong from the view of 10 weeks later, which happened to be the relevant period, and during which my net worth was evaporating and my liquid assets were getting less liquid and so on. So it's all I can tell you, it's very difficult. And the interesting thing about it, of course, is A.W. Jones was a darling of the late 1960s, and Carol Loomis is here, and she wrote an article called "The Jones Nobody Keeps Up With," and it's a very interesting article. But nobody was writing articles about A.W. Jones in 1979. I mean, something went wrong, and there were spin-offs from his operation. Carl Jones spun off from his operation. Dick Radcliffe spun off from his operation. You can go down the list. And out of many that left, a very high percentage of them bit the dust, including suicides, cab drivers, subsequent employment, the whole thing. And these people there was a book written in the late 60s, had a lot of pictures in it. I don't remember the name of it, but it showed all these portraits of all these people that were highly successful in the hedge fund business, but they didn't bring out a second edition. So it's just tough. Logically, it should work well, but the math of you can't short a lot of something. You can buy till the cows come home if you got the money. You can buy the whole company if need be, but you can't short the whole company. A fellow named Robert Wilson, there's some interesting stories about him. He's a very smart guy, and he took a trip to Asia one time being short. I think it was Resorts International, or maybe it was Mary Carter Paint, it was still called in those days. And he lost a lot of money before he got back to this country. He's a very smart guy. He made a lot of money shorting stocks, but it just takes one to kill you. And you need more and more money as the stock goes up. You don't need more and more money when a stock goes down if you paid for it originally and didn't buy it on margin. You just sit and find out whether you were right or not. But you can't necessarily sit and find out whether you're right on being short a stock. What was the first question again?
It was how a youngster like myself would define and develop a circle of competence.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I would say this: if you have doubts about something being in your circle of competence, it isn't. I mean, in other words, I would look down the lists of businesses, and I will bet you that you can understand a Coke bottler, you can understand the Coca-Cola company, you can understand McDonald's, you can understand in a general way General Motors. You may not be able to value it, but there are all kinds of business. You can certainly understand Walmart. That doesn't mean whether you decide whether what the price should be, but you understand Walmart. You can understand Costco. And if you get to something that your friend is buying or that everybody says a lot of money's going to be made in, you're not sure whether you understand it or not, you don't. And it's better to be well within the circle than to be trying to tiptoe along the line. And you'll find plenty of things within the circle. I mean, it's not terrible to have a small circle of competence. I'd say my circle of competence is pretty small, but it's big enough. I can find a few things. And when somebody calls me with a Larson Jewel, that is within my circle of competence. I hadn't even thought about it before, but I know it's within it. I mean, I can evaluate a business like that. And if I get called, I got called the other day on a very large finance company. I understand what they do, but I don't understand everything that's going on within it, and I don't understand whether I can continually fund it, on a basis independent from using Berkshire's credit and so on. So even though I could understand every individual transaction they did, I don't regard the whole enterprise or the operation of it necessarily as being within my circle of competence. Charlie?
Yeah, I think that if you have competence, you almost automatically have a feeling of where the edge of the competence is. Because after all, it wouldn't be much of a competence if you didn't know its boundary. And so I think you've asked a question that almost answers itself. And my guess is you do know what you're in all kinds of areas. And you do have all kinds of other areas where you know you'd be over your depth. I mean, you're not trying to play chess against Bobby Fischer or do stunts on the high trapeze if you've had no training for it. My guess is you know pretty well where the boundaries of your competence lies, and I think you also probably know pretty well where you want to stretch the boundary. And you've got to stretch the boundary by working at it, including practice.
One of the drawbacks to Berkshire, of course, is that Charlie and our circles largely overlap, so you don't get two big complete circles at all, but that's just the way it is. Probably why we get along so well, too. Number 7.
I'm Lowell Chrisman from Phoenix, Arizona. I'm retired and teaching in seniors in high school. I wish they could be here to hear you today. I'm teaching these people an investment course part-time. And the first class I went to, they asked me to teach them how to prepare for retirement. I would like to know what the 2 or 3 things are that you would suggest that I include in this course.
What the hell does Warren know about retirement?
Yeah, we haven't even thought about it. Now, let me give you one suggestion for that group. I use this sometimes when I talk to a bunch of high school seniors down in Nebraska, Westland, a few weeks ago. But tell the youngsters in the class, they're probably around 16 or 17. And if they're like I was when I was 16, I was only thinking of 2 things, and Martin's Aunt Barbara wasn't going out with me, so I was down to cars. I tried hearses, but that didn't work. And let's assume, and I use this let's assume a genie appeared to you when you turned 16, and the genie said, you get any car you want tomorrow morning tied up in a big pink ribbon, anything you name, and it can be a Rolls Royce, it can be a Jaguar, it can be a Lexus, you name it, and that car will be there, and you don't owe me a penny. And having heard the genie stories before, you say to the genie, what's the catch? And of course the genie says, well, there's just one. That car, which you're going to get tomorrow morning, car of your dreams, is the only car you're ever going to get. So you can pick one, but that's it. And you still name whatever the car of your dreams is, and the next morning you receive that car. Now, what do you do knowing that's the only car you're going to have for the rest of your life? Well, you read the owner's manual about 10 times before you put the key in the ignition. You keep it garaged. You change the oil twice as often as they tell you to do. You keep the tires inflated properly. If you get a little nick, you fix it that day so it doesn't rust on you. In other words, you make sure that this car of your dreams at age 16 is going to still be the car of your dreams at age 50 or 60 because you treat it as the only one you'll ever get in your lifetime. And then I would suggest to your students in Phoenix that they are going to get exactly one mind and one body. And that's the mind and body they're going to have at age 40 and 50 and 60. And it isn't so much a question of preparing for retirement precisely at those ages. It's a question of preparing for life at those ages, and that they should treat the importance of taking care and maximizing that mind and taking care of that body in a way that when they get to be 50 or 60 or 70, they've got a real asset instead of something that's rusted and been ignored over the years. And it will be too late to think about that when they're 60 or 70. You can't repair the car back into the shape it was. You can maintain it. And in the case of a mind, you can enhance it in a very big way over time. But the most important asset your students have is themselves. I will take a person graduating from college, and assuming they're in normal shape and everything, I will be glad to pay them, probably $50,000 for 10% of all their earnings for the rest of their lives. Well, if I'm willing to pay them 10% for $50,000 for 10%, that means they're worth $500,000 if they haven't got a dime in their pocket, as long as they've got a good mind and a good body. Now, that asset is far, far more important than any other asset they've got, unless they've been very lucky in terms of inheritance or something. But overwhelmingly, their main asset is themselves, and they ought to treat their main asset as they would any other asset that was divorced from themselves. And if they do that and they start thinking about it now, and they develop the habits that maintain and enhance the asset, they will have a very good car, mind, and body when they get to be 60. And if they don't, they'll have a wreck. Charlie?
I'm Bob Klein from Los Angeles. I wonder if you could give us a glimpse into your investment process, the way you approach looking at a particular industry. And I wonder if you could use real estate as an example. I know real estate hasn't been a huge part of Berkshire's portfolio over the years, and I wonder if that's because you view real estate as a commodity business, or if maybe the cash flows from real estate tend to be more predictable than perhaps from some other industries, and thus it tends to be less likely to be mispriced and therefore less likely to find terrific bargains in real estate. So,
go ahead.
So just wondering if we could, if we were watching a discussion between you and Charlie hashing out the merits of real estate, how it would go.
Well, it would go like all our other conversations. He would say no for about 15 minutes, and I would gauge by the degree to which the motion he put into his nose whether he really liked the deal or not. But we both had a fair amount of experience in real estate, and Charlie made his early money in real estate. The second point is the more important point. Real estate is not a commodity, but I think it tends to be more accurately priced, particularly developed real estate, more accurately priced most of the time. Now, during the RTC period, when you had huge amounts of transactions and you had an owner that didn't want to be an owner in a very big way, and they didn't know what the hell they owned and all of that sort of thing. I mean, you had a lot of mispricing then, and I know a few people in this room that made a lot of money off of that. But under most conditions, it's hard to find real estate that's really mispriced. I mean, when I look at the transactions that REITs engage in currently, and you get a lot of information on that sort of thing, you know, they're very similar, but it's a competitive world, and you know, they all know about what a Class A office building in Chicago or wherever it may be is going to produce. So at least they may all be wrong, as it turns out, because of some unusual events, but it's hard to argue with the current conventional wisdom most of the time in the real estate world. But occasionally there have been some, there could be big opportunities in the field. But if they exist, it will certainly be because there'll be a lot of chaos in real estate financing for one reason or another. We've done some real estate financing, and you have to have the money shut off to quite a degree, probably, to get any big mispricing across the board. Charlie?
Yeah, we don't have any competitive advantage over experienced real estate investors in the field, and we wouldn't have if we were operating with our own money as a partnership. And if you operate as a corporation such as ours, which is taxable under Chapter C of the Internal Revenue Code, you've got a whole layer of corporate taxes between the real estate income and the use of the income by the people who own the real estate. So by its nature, real estate tends to be a very lousy investment for people who are taxed under Subchapter C of the code relating to corporations.
Hello, my name is Joseph LaPre. I'm a shareholder from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to ask a question. Mr. Buffett, you mentioned earlier today that you'd be willing to sell insurance in exchange for stock options. If possible, could you please describe a methodology for the valuation of stock options, particularly in cases where there is no market pricing data available for the option being valued?
Yeah, I could figure out what I would pay for an option on a private business. I could figure out what I could pay for an option on a public business, might be a little easier. I could figure out what I'd pay for an option on an apartment house or a farm. I had a friend, when I was 20 years old, we developed a big plan. We were going to go out and option farms, outside of what were then the city limits of Omaha, and we figured that if we offered a farmer a modest amount, which would be annual income to him, to option his farm at double the price it was bringing then, that it would, he would be happy to sell for double the price that year, and maybe we could do something, and it might have worked out okay. Every option has value. I've got a house worth X. If you offer me a few dollars to give you an option at 2x for 10 years, I'm not going to take it, because there are all kinds of possibilities in terms of inflation. All options have value, and people that get options usually understand that better than people that give options. I'm not talking about stock options now, but in other arenas. So we would be happy. I mean, whether I could, we'll just pull one out of the air. Let's take an untraded company like Mars Inc. Or would I be happy to have an option, a 10-year option on a piece of Mars Inc. at some given price? Sure, I would. And there's an amount I would take for that. I would take in lieu of getting cash if I was writing a big insurance policy with Mars Inc. They're not going to do this with me, and I would be happy. And instead of, if you buy homeowners insurance from me, if you want to give me an option on your house for 10 years, I'll take that in lieu of the premium. I'll make my own calculations to value. It won't be Black-Scholes, although that might be the best arrangement under many circumstances. But I would probably crank in my own case. We bought and sold options. As a matter of fact, on June 3rd, Berkshire Hathaway will receive $60 million if the S&P 500 closes at 1150 something or below. And 2 years ago, when the S&P was 14 something, we agreed for, on that June 3rd option or whatever it was, $400 million nominal value, where in effect the counterparty would get the profit above 2,000 and something, 42% up from the current cash price, and we got the profit between 5 and 20% on the downside on a put. People who were calculating the values of options at that time under traditional methods felt that that was a cashless transaction, that the value of the call that we gave was equal to the value of the put that we received. I decided differently. So we don't accept blindly option values as determined by the calculations of people who win Nobel Prizes. Instead, we actually put an aspect of judgment into some. There would be businesses that would come out with identical Black-Scholes values on options for 10 years, and we would pay a different amount for one than the other, maybe a significantly different amount. But we would pay something for just about any option. And, it is the nature of prices in this world to change and economic conditions to change. And an option is a chance to participate in a change without giving up anything other than that original premium you pay. Many people just don't seem to grasp that. But believe me, the people who are getting options on stock do grasp that, and the people who are giving them, which are the shareholders, represented by a group like this, who don't have any real voice in giving it, but they sometimes don't fully realize what's being given away. Imagine it, going up a few miles away from here and having 2 farms for sale, and you say to the guy, how much do you want for them? They both say $1,000 an acre, but the one guy says, but every year I want you to option, I want you to give me 2% of the place back at 1,000. So, at the end of 10 years, 20% of the upside belongs to me, but you've got all the downside. I mean, which farm are you going to buy? The one without the options or the one with the options? It's not very complicated. And we are dead serious when we say we will take options in lieu of cash. Incidentally, the company that gives us those options in lieu of cash for an insurance premium has to record the expense in terms of the fair value of the option they've given us. The only item for which they don't have to record that as expense is compensation. But if they give it to us for their light bill, or they give it to us for their insurance premium, or they give it to us for their rent, they have to call it a cost. But only when it comes to the CEO's compensation and other people like it do they not have to record it as a cost. And that's because they've been able to get Congress to bow to their will and to their campaign contributions. Charlie?
Yeah, the Black-Scholes crowd really did get a Nobel Prize for inventing this formula to value options, not executive stock options, but just options generally. And if you don't know anything about the company except the past price history of stock transactions,
dividend,
and the dividend being paid. And if the option is over a very short term, it's a very good way of approximating the value of the option. But if it's a long-term option and you think you know something, it's an insane way to value the option. And Wall Street is full of people with IQs of 150 that are using Black-Scholes to value options that shouldn't be tortured into the model. And all of corporate of America is using Black-Scholes to price stock options in the footnotes of the accounting statements. And they do that because it comes up with the lowest cost number.
Well, they not only do that, but they assume the term is less than the actual term of the option. And I mean, they'll do everything they can. And I've been in on these discussions. They'll do everything they can to make the number look as low as possible. It's that simple.
And they're using a phony process to determine the number in the first place. So it's a Mad Hatter's Tea Party. And the only thing that's consistent in it is that the whole thing is disgusting.
Good afternoon. Mike and Bean from Chelmsford, Massachusetts. I noticed in the annual report that you took a charge off for Dexter and put under the management of H.H. Brown. And I was thinking back, I believe in 1985, you wrote about the process you went through in closing the textile business. And I was wondering if you could elaborate how this situation is different. I believe you indicated in the textile business that despite excellent management, it wasn't possible to earn an economic return on the assets.
Yeah. Did you say that we took a charge off on H.H. Brown?
No, I meant to say we took a charge off on Dexter.
Oh, Dexter. Yeah, absolutely. We lost a very significant amount of money on Dexter thanks to a dumb decision that I made, and maybe several dumb decisions. And I mean that is a business that went offshore in a huge way. There are close to 1,200,000,000 pairs of shoes made in or used in this country. I never can figure out how they get to that number. I mean, I use a pair about every 5 years, but 4 for every man, woman, and child. I don't know, but that's the number. And you know, I don't know whether it's 5% now, but it's something in that area are made in this country, and hundreds of thousands of jobs have gone offshore with that. The textile business, as you know, has gotten almost destroyed in this country. I mean, when you have somebody like Burlington go into bankruptcy, you know, wonderful company, spent lots of money on keeping their plants up to date and all of that sort of thing. But in the end, you know, if you're paying 10 times as much per hour for labor as somebody else, it's awfully hard to be that good. And that's going on in furniture manufacturing now too. We have a number of furniture retailers, and you know, Bill Child or Herb Blumpkin will go over to the Orient fairly frequently now. We buy a lot of furniture comes from there, and that trend is moving in that direction in a very significant way. And your question was your question why Fruit of the Loom would be different?
No, I was just wondering if there's any hope for Dexter, or if it's going down the same path.
Oh no, well Dexter is now part of H.H. Brown, and it's selling product which overwhelmingly is produced abroad. And H.H. Brown sells a very significant amount of product that's produced outside the United States, although they still produce a lot of product in the United States. But no, the Dexter, we will have a significant shoe business. The shoe business, we had some contracts on the books from Dexter that were unprofitable, and they will run for another quarter. But we made a fair amount of money in the shoe business in the first quarter. Justin made money. I think our shoe business will be okay. It won't be a bonanza over time, but I think our shoe business, we've got very good management in there. We've got good management at H.H. Brown. We've got good management at Justin. And I would expect that we would have a substantial and a reasonably profitable shoe business in the future, but we will not be able to do it with 100% or 90% or 80% domestic produced shoes. And in that respect, I was very wrong in paying what I did and paying it in the manner I did, which was stock in the case of Dexter, for a domestic shoe manufacturer. Charlie?
Yeah, that shows, which is important to show, that no matter how hard you work at having systems for avoiding error and practices of trying to stay within your circle of competency, et cetera, you still make mistakes. And I think I can confidently promise that it won't be our last mistake.
Okay, here's our blue chip stamps. But you might think about this a bit too. We had a lot of workers up in Dexter, Maine, and we've had a lot of workers at some of the H.H. Brown plants, and we take a little hit financially, and we make it up by some trading strategy in government bonds or something like that requires no effort and not really too much brain power. And when you think of the consequences to the people that have spent a lifetime learning one trade, and who live in those areas, and through no fault of their own, none. I mean, they've done a good job. They've done a great job working. They're productive, but in the end, their cost was 10 times or more, and they weren't getting paid that well, but they're 10 times what it could get done for elsewhere in the world. So we haven't really paid the price for that change in economic conditions. I mean, it's the people who work there, the people who work at Burlington or wherever where the jobs disappear. And that's no argument for huge tariffs or anything of the sort. But retraining doesn't do much good if you worked in our textile mill, as many people did years ago, and you're 60 years old and you only speak Portuguese. Or if you work in Dexter, Maine, and you're 58, I mean, retraining it gets kind of meaningless. So we're the lucky ones, basically in these situations, and it is tough when you know one trade, particularly if you live in a small town, not lots of other employment opportunities or things. So, we have a charge off, and they have a huge change in their lives, basically. Number 6.
My name is Rian Martins from Cape Town, South Africa, and I became a big fan and avid reader of your ideas about 10 years ago. In 1999, I did an MBA and was nicknamed Warren Buffett because I quoted you in all the classroom discussions. All I wanted to learn was how to value a stock and think about stock prices, but sadly I was rather disappointed to find out that our MBA did not really teach that. Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger, my question is this. If you had to predict who would be the superior investors from a group of young, bright people who share your investment philosophy and possess the realism and discipline you referred to earlier, which characteristics or work habits would you like to know about the individuals in the group, and what weighting would you place on each factor to ensure the greatest probability of your prediction being correct?
Well, that's too easy a question for me, so I'll let Charlie answer that.
I think the fair answer to that one is that I'm not capable of answering it.
No, but I do. I think this. I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you ask me, how should you pick a wife? 18% to humor, 12% to looks, 17%, to parents. I can't give you the formula, but I think you'll make the right decision. When you get. And I think if Charlie and I were around a dozen very bright MBAs with good records and all of that, and we spent some time with them, I think we'd have a reasonable chance of picking somebody from that group that might not necessarily be number one, but they would be in the upper quartile in terms of how they actually turned out. But I can't tell you. I can't tell you how to. I can't write out a software program or anything that will enable you to do that. I had that problem exactly at Solomon on that Saturday morning, whatever it was, August 17th, and I had to pick a guy to run the place, and there were a dozen or so people that all thought that they were the ones, or a number of them thought they were the ones to run it. And they all had high IQs, and they all had lots of experience in investment banking and everything. And in the end, I had to pick one. And I did pick the right one, I will say that. And, could I be 100% sure at that time it was the right one? Well, probably not, but I felt pretty sure I had the right one. And I can't tell you. I've had people say to me, well, what did you ask them and how did you evaluate it? Because I only had about 3 hours to do it. And I don't know. I mean, I can't write you out a set of questions that you should ask somebody. Some of it may be body language and different things of that sort. There are a lot of variables in it. But I think in the end, you would have picked the same person I picked if you'd been in that spot. You'd have had to pick somebody in the 3 hours. But quantifying it for you, I can't do it. Charlie, have you got new?
Yeah. Well, when multiple factors are causing success, you get these anomalies. You could have two people who are going to be equally successful, and one is terribly good at A and terrible at Z, and the other is terribly good at Z and is very good at Z and terrible at A. They're equal. Which factor is most important? The answer, it doesn't matter in that case. When you got multiple factors, great strength in one will compensate some for weakness in another. And the factors can be quite different. I think the investment world is full of people who are succeeding based on quite different sorts of talent.
We'll try to do better next year. Number 8.